Hey everybody, your old pal Shawn here. Glad to have you. We have a great show for you today. We're going to cover some of the most controversial issues in our world, and we're going to see if we can find some common ground in those. Before we begin, please, if you enjoy what I'm doing, give it a like, share, follow, comment, subscribe, whatever platform you have this on. And if you have the financial means, you really enjoy what we're doing, please consider checking out my givesendgo.com/SZP, that for Shawn Zemba podcast, because I want to increase the production quality. I want to spend more time putting things out for you, creating excellent content. We're not there yet. The set, as you can see, is very basic, there's a lot of grounds to cover. Let's just say that. All right. So thank you very much. And let's get started. Before we sink into the really deep subjects, I just want to touch on one thing. The name, the Shawn Zemba podcast. And to be honest with you, I did not want to use my name in it. But I spent a year and a half from the time when I came up with the idea to the launch, looking for different names. And it just so happened that every name I found was taken by somebody on some platform. I remember the last one I tried, I searched everywhere. I'm checking copyrights and trademarks and Spotify and Google, and I'm looking it up. I'm not finding it. Yes, I have a logo made. I'm in love. It's so cool. And then when I go to register the YouTube channel, somebody had already taken the name. And even though it was a year or so ago since the last recording, even though there are just a few videos, would have been a dick move if I moved in on that. So I eventually settled and used my name. Hopefully one day I'll come up with one I like a little more, and we'll shift everybody over there. So that's the story on that. Let's get started on these topics. If you haven't watched the introduction video, I urge you to do that. What this channel is about is bringing people together. We're trying to shift cultures and consciousness to help us all move in a better direction. It's so easy in today's society to be a divided people and to just shrink ourselves to fit the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I want us all to move in a direction that brings us closer together. In a world where we're financially incentivized to divide, I could easily make this channel a lot more popular by just having catchy thumbnails that are going to send the world for videos that going to send the world in a darker place. I would just pick a side, look at the most extreme examples on that side, and then make fun of them and say they're coming for your family, they're coming for your children, we got to stop them. I don't want to do that. I want to bring us together, because one of the things I noticed working in warehouses, going to restaurants, is that a lot of people who, in their minds, are on opposite sides of issues actually have a lot of common ground at a values level. The difference is that they have different information. So they see these subjects in a different light. And because of this variation in the data that they have coming in, they also have different ideas on what strategies would best serve those values. All too often, I'll look in the comments on social media and I'll see people who actually agree, but they're so used to using a particular slogan or terminology that they just can't bridge that gap, and they're seeing each other as enemies and talking around one another, when really, at the core of it, at the heart of it, there's a lot of alignment. There is a somewhat common phrase that I see variations of on social media, and it goes something like this: People say that I can't have friends with different opinions. I can, but I can't have people who have different values as friends. If friends and family members are believed by others that they shouldn't, if other people, let me rephrase that. If other people believe that my friends and family members shouldn't exist, then we're not aligned. We can't be friends. And that would make sense. And there are extreme examples of people who've been radicalized to an intense degree. People who've been very hurt by a particular segment of the population. People who've been seriously misinformed, very ignorant, or just plain destructive people. Some of the stats that I've seen over the years are, in a given population, people with psychopathic tendencies who fall somewhere on that spectrum, they're usually 1 to 3% of a given population, and much more than that, then they start getting wiped out because people can't stand the nonsense that they cause. So, in my mind, this is how I view the culture. 1 to 3%, including both poles, both of the main political poles, are just that way. They're just destructive. It's something in their nature. And it's particularly sharp because of how they've been oriented and how they've been informed. That determines their alignment. Who are they for? Who are they against? What do they think the right course of action for our world is? But the media makes it sound like half the country or half the world is your enemy, no matter what side you're on a particular issue. They want to paint the rest of the population that's not giving them money, not giving them attention, as the evil ones. And I'm here to say that there's actually a lot of common ground. People agree more than they think. They have the same values more often than not. But the difference is the information that they're getting. So, to illustrate the point, in this episode, we're going to talk about some very intense subjects. And to be honest with you, I'm a little nervous to bring it up. We're going to talk about transgenderism. We're going to talk about immigration. And we're going to see if, in these highly polarized issues, can we build some bridges? Can we help de-radicalize hearts? Can we help reach across that divide and grasp the hands of our neighbors and pull them closer to us? Is there anything we can do? So, let's look at the mechanics of how cultures swing. For so many years, there have been populations whose voices have been suppressed. Women didn't have the right to vote, didn't have the right to speak. In different countries, whoever ended up to being a minority often were subjugated in one way or another. Their voices limited. Their character questioned. And then when that comes back around, often you have generations of hurt feelings coming out. Sometimes it's messy. Just like if there was a bad relationship that two people had, and one of them just kept their mouth shut for so long until they can't do it anymore, and then it comes out and they have such hateful things to say, and they've had so many friends who were hurt or bullied or took their lives or assaulted or whatever the case may be, and they're not going to take it anymore, and they become super sensitive to questions or people not being familiar, because to them they generalize it and it feels too much like the sting of the past, and they say never again. But If we take less controversial subjects, let's look at history, at science, at innovation. There are many art even. There are many figures whose work was considered ahead of its time. And then a generation, 2 generations after they passed, they're considered geniuses. Well, sometimes when you introduce ideas to a culture too rapidly, there can be a lot of friction, a lot of intensity. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, swimming suits, particularly for women, were far less revealing. They would be covered full body. It's not just that. Sometimes, past their knees, sometimes lower than that, depending on what era we're looking at. Well, today, if you go to a beach, people are rather scantily clad very often. Now, that shift, whether you think it's moral or not, that shift, if someone tried to wear today's outfits back then, would have been considered outrageous. It's too quick of a cultural shift. But if you go from having your knees covered to a little bit above your knees to, you have the one-piece bathing suit to a modest bikini to like a string bikini and then body paint and things like that, one step at a time, it's easier to make progress. And this happened over 10 decades. It took a long time for that cultural shift to happen. So sometimes when a new idea is introduced, it's a long time before it comes of age. And often the slower the integration into society, the less resistance, because people are more familiar with it. They're more ready for it. In the same way that if someone never worked out and then all of a sudden they're going to try and do the Navy SEAL preparation workout, and then they're just training for hours, and then they break down their system, they tear something, their immune system fails, they're sick, they're sore for a month, and then they're never going to train again. That's not productive. Once in a great while, there's somebody in that particular moment of their life with the right motivation, right situation that might work out for. But the vast majority of people, that's a recipe for disaster. Let's take another situation. Let's say someone lives in a tropical climate, and then they move farther up north where it snows a lot. They live in the mountains. Well, that's going to be that change in temperature is going to be hard on them. It's going to be very intense, and they'll really need to dress warmly. But people who are acclimated to it, you'll see them walking around with like a sweater and shorts, or pants and a t-shirt, because they're really used to the weather. Now, if we often don't notice it as much if we stay in the same region during a change of seasons, because often, except for freak storms or a rare occurrence, the shift is gradual enough that we can begin to get used to it. I live in the US, so 40 degrees in the spring feels pretty warm. You might have a t-shirt on, but if it's suddenly 40 degrees in the summer, which is maybe half the temperature, or if you live in the desert, maybe a third of the temperature, that'd be bitterly cold. When you have a shift that happens too fast, there's a lot of the structures that are destroyed. Let's look at a business. I have a lot of history in production, and people often want to make changes. When a change is implemented and there are many shifts going on at the same time, they have to be stable for a long time until everyone has new habits trained and has new understandings. Okay, the quality checks are now this. The bathroom breaks are now this. Until that time, not everybody's even informed, let alone on board. And even if they know about it, sometimes it takes a little bit until, oh yeah, it's different now. I have to do it this way until the new habits developed. In times of stress, people are going to fall into the most repeated patterns. And if someone's in a rush, they're trying to get something done, they're going to fall into the most repeated thing. And then, I forgot things are different now. I should have done the new way. But this can't happen when, a week later, 2 weeks later, there's new changes, and then another set of changes, then another set of changes. That because everyone's not even informed, they don't even have a chance to redevelop new habits, new patterns of ways of doing things. So it's unstable and it's messy and the shifts are unsuccessful because they're so rapid. And it takes time for the whole supply chain and to adjust to these shifts. This is what happens in our culture sometimes when a shift is occurring too quickly. Now let's begin with transgenderism. I was almost 19 years old when I met my first transgender person. I was visiting my ex-girlfriend. I was trying to win her back. She lived kind of far away. And during this time, her best friend was hanging out. And at this time, at least to me and a lot of the public, this person was presenting as female. And this person's super cool, really nice to me, funny. We connected in some ways. I had a good time, even though things didn't work out for me in terms of winning back my ex. I thought that person was really cool. Sometime later, my ex got involved with this individual. And then sometime after that, I became aware that this individual was presenting as male. Now, I hadn't really heard of this before. I was a month and a half short of being 19, and I never heard of this before. I heard of cross-dressers and drag queens, and I thought, okay, well, that's a kink people have. And I heard of occasionally a joke about a lady boy in Thailand, and I hope that's not an inappropriate thing, but I thought, maybe that's just a kink catering to a closeted homosexual who can't accept their feelings or whatnot. I thought of it as a business decision, not in like a prostitution scenario. I didn't think of it as like akin to an orientation. And by the way, my high school had a robust arts academy, and I was in theater. I was friends with so many gays and lesbians and bi individuals. It to me, in my classes, it seemed like almost everybody was somewhere in the community, right? I mean, I knew a couple of the girls were straight, but it seemed like everybody was at least flirting with the kitty. I'm not saying that was true, but that's how it seemed to me from my perspective. So I had a very high opinion of the community because everyone I knew was super cool. But I never heard of trans. And after I met this person, never heard of trans. By the way, I'm not in touch anymore, but to my last information, that was 2003. We're in 2025. That first trans individual I met, he's been with my ex decades. And by the way, my ex was a little younger than me, and this person was a little bit younger than my ex. At a super young age, higher level of maturity, ability to connect, build relationships than I've ever managed. So kudos to that person. When I heard this individual was presenting as male, I thought it was a little strange because I'd never heard of it before. I never heard of this. And when I say it, I mean the situation, not the person. I just never heard of these circumstances before. And I thought, that's super cool. Then I met this person with this 1 in 10 million circumstance. All right. And then I didn't meet another trans individual for a very long time. 2013, I was at work and there's somebody presenting as male and thought nothing of it because this person's born with the male biological equipment. Couple years later, that person goes through a transition, starts presenting as female. And again, this person was cordial, nice, professional, friendly, and I had no problems with this person. I just thought, okay, I met two of this 1 in 10 million kind of circumstance. That's pretty cool. Not a negative thing to say about that person. And then somewhere 2016 or 2017, I'm in my 30s at this point. Then I finally heard the word transgender. And to me, I thought, okay, so there's a word for people with this experience. Cool. And then I didn't meet another trans person for years. And I had only heard it in reference to a person who had one birth set of biological equipment, feeling a conflict with that, and identifying and experiencing more as the opposite. So, male, female, female, male kind of thing. This is all I understood it as. But in the next couple of years, I would hear, okay, well, there are people who are gender fluid, or there are people who are non-binary. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting that people experience this. And I knew about people who are born premature, for example. Their genitalia might not fully form. So somewhere between the two main sets of biological equipment, there's some degree of variation in development. And I was also aware that occasionally someone might have some degree of development of both. But this didn't seem to apply to trans as I understood it, because they just had the regular set of equipment, but there was some kind of conflict with their biology as I understood it. And I just thought, okay. But when I would hear non-binary or gender fluid, I thought it was unusual because I'd never met anyone like that. And the way gender was always presented to me my whole life was in school textbooks. Males have this set of anatomy. Females have this set of anatomy. And that's how I always understood gender. And I thought transgender might just be a term for people who are opposing the poles, have an opposing experience to the pole that they have at birth. Okay, cool. 2021, I'm going to work and I met another trans person, this one female biological equipment presenting male. And this person's super cool. This person's one of my friends to this day. We still talk. And I used to love talking to this individual. And my whole attitude with that was, hey, you could go by whatever name you want. Sometimes someone named Robert wants to be called Rob or Robbie or Bob or Bobby or whatever. That takes nothing from me. I'll call you whatever you want. And at this point, I still haven't encountered anybody with a more obscure or unique experience on the trans spectrum, I'll say. It was just switching poles. But anyway, this person's super cool. We're still in touch. When we met, this person was pretty left-leaning, and, years later, this person's more right, more libertarian in views. Some things happen to cause these shifts. But, super cool. So I'm in my 30s at that point, and I had only met 3 trans people in my life. In 2024, up until 2024, I only met 3. Now I'm at 5. And one of them I met at a bar, was presenting female this whole time, was flirting a little bit. I flirted back, but I made it clear, I wasn't looking for the same kind of experience. And we were just friendly. And then this person revealed, hey, going through a transition, going to a male thing. And I said, hey, we could stay in touch. We could still hang out. We could still be friends. I'm just going to cut the flirting off. And so, I'm not into where you're going with this, but all that. And very cool. That person, awesome. And then a few months later at another job, I met another individual presenting as male. And I found out a little bit later, female biological equipment at birth, whatnot. And I just think, hey, this person's super cool. We're still friends. We still talk. We would hang out. I mean, we haven't, but we would. Our schedules just don't line up anymore. But it's just, everybody I met was super cool. Now, I haven't met any of the people who've been very hurt in the trans group, who are very touchy on the subject. They all felt comfortable talking to, well, except for the first coworker, but I mean, everyone felt pretty comfortable, and it didn't come up very often. Fair enough. I don't know the rules to some of these other pronouns and genders that are being spoken of. But this is where a lot of the conflict comes. Because I talk to my mom, always been left-leaning. Her family, lot of carny folk experience, She was a bartender for almost 40 years. Lot of gay and lesbian friends. One of her first friends, one of the only people she's still in touch with, is someone she grew up with, a gay man. But we talked about this, and she never met a trans person. She never heard of this. It's completely unfamiliar. And what trans people need to understand is there are tens of millions of people who've never met a trans person. Never even heard of trans until a couple years ago. So it doesn't seem real to them. That might sound very ignorant, but think of it this way. If someone said, hey, there's this new way to use AI and you can be a millionaire because this guy did it. Well, you don't know anyone who had that happen to them. You never did it. It never occurred in your proximity. It doesn't feel real. That doesn't make somebody's not making millions of dollars off AI. But it means that it's not common enough in your experience to feel real. It doesn't seem like a real option. For tons of people, if you're trans and they met you at work and you build a relationship that way, they'd be top supporters of you. They would love you. They would defend you. But because they have a lack of experience, a lack of familiarity, they go, well, what do you mean there are different genders? For my whole life, gender was always equated to biological equipment. There seemed to be 2 sets. There seem to be 2 options. And then there's some degree of development in between. And trans people often don't have one of these variations in development. That's often called intersex, from what I understand. So what do you mean by different genders? And a lot of people think kind of like I did. I thought, well, there's the stereotypical female girly girl. And somewhere on that spectrum, there might be like the tomboy, which is, girls, she might like to wrestle with the guys or play sports or some of the, video games or whatever. And then there's like the more stereotypically masculine female who, maybe she's wearing flannel and has a short haircut. And I hope I'm sorry to be stereotyping, but I have to use words. And often, the farther someone was with the female biological equipment towards the masculine orientation, often they were lesbians. I didn't care one way or another where they fell or what they were attracted to. And on the same way, on the masculine end, you have the stereotypical manly guy. He's on the farm. He's fighting at war. He's building trenches and doing man shit. And then, you have the more feminine person. And then you have like the girly guy. And often, not always, but often, the more feminine personality with masculine biological equipment, they turned out gay. In my whole life, that none of these things ever seemed to be equated to gender. There's just sexual orientation and things like that. These were more familiar concepts to people. When you're introducing the idea that, okay, well, there's a vast spectrum of how, and the way I'm looking at it now and trying to describe it, because I'm trying to use neutral terminology, and a lot of people in the LGBTQA+, when they refer to gender, it's not specifically biological equipment. What they're referring to are profound psychophysiological states that they experience, that they identify with, and that's more what they're leaning towards gender. And it's a way of affirming the identity represented by that state. And they're calling that gender. Because, imagine if you feel, imagine you're the gender you are, but then you wake up and you use the restroom and you have the opposite set of equipment. And there's some kind of like conflict there. And then every time you use the restroom or each time you flirt with somebody, it's in the back of your head. It's reminding you that you're not what you want to be, what you feel you are at the deepest level. There's some deep, vast conflict there. So that hurts. If a lot of the people on the right who are questioning trans things now, it's because they haven't heard about this and have never met a trans person. And this is an entirely different way of using terminology. I wish there was a different word that was used instead of gender, because I think that would help bridge the divide and open minds, because so many people for so long have heard it as gender equals biological equipment that they get stuck on that when they would actually align and feel sympathy for and want to support the actual person. But since they don't have a specific person they've met, and particularly a good relationship with the person they met, it doesn't seem as real. It feels like something that just came out of nowhere to a lot of people. Now, I hear a lot of people on the left, they think that people on the right want to round them up like the Nazis did with the Jews, and starting with the disabled people. And I'm sure that there's some psychopathic 1% of the population that wants that. But if you would watch any of the mainstream right-wing influencers, nobody's talking about that. I happened to stumble across a song that has a lyric, and I'm not endorsing the lyric. I'm not anti the lyric. I'm just stating the information of the lyric because it seems to be a concise representation of how people on the right feel. The mainstream is not about rounding up trans people. They are worried about kids, and this is how they see it. So this is the lyric. It's not my lyric. You can look it up. Hope I remember it now, but it goes something like this. Butchering kids as a remedy for feeling confused at puberty. Selling pure evil as sympathy, and getting rich in the sex change industry. you see, people on the right, they have questions. Well, where did this come from? Why is it that I never heard of trans until a couple of years ago? And why is it so many people in Hollywood, California, New York, Chicago, why are so many of them trans and the population is so much smaller in Oklahoma, in Texas, in Arkansas? And you might attribute a certain degree of that to not being out. Even if I'm super generous and say that, well, only 10% of the people were out before, and now it's 10 times that number. Well, that still mean I only met, that would still mean I only would have met 50 trans people in my life. That's a very small number out of the thousands. And again, not only was I in theater with lots of gay and lesbian friends, but I was in yoga circles and hippie circles and new age circles. And I was not, this is not something I was encountering. Realize that there are whole generations of people who've never met a trans person, never encountered this. So when you're introducing a lot of concepts, you're going to encounter the same friction as, say, an inventor that's ahead of their time. As, say, Galileo saying that the Earth goes around the sun. You're going to encounter friction, and it's not because they hate you. It's because it takes a long time for a whole system of people to even become aware of something, let alone understand it, let alone gain buy-in. But because there was so much repression and oppression for so long of people in the LGBTQA plus community, and because so many people have been hurt, these questions or these doubts are felt as attacks. And sometimes they are. From people who don't have any familiar, it's like, well, how could this be real if it just happened? A lot of people on the right, they'll look at transgender akin to, say, anorexia. And they say, well, an anorexic, they can be treated. They have the impression that they're obese when they're skeletally thin. So that's a tragic thing that happens. It's a confusion about how they perceive their biology, but they can be treated. That is how they're seeing it. People on the left are looking at trans issues in a different way. They're saying, well, these are real people and they have these experiences. And if someone in their heart feels, say, that they're a woman, and you're calling them a man because of that, because of their biology, you're attacking them because, and reminding them something that they know every moment of their lives, that they're not what they want to be. But if you acknowledge them and affirm their identity, and affirm their gender matches their identity, that can ease some of that constant pain. And pain management is a life-saving measure. And people who aren't for that are for dooming these people. And a lot of people on the left of this issue, they're saying, we want to help people and we want to help kids find this alignment in themselves as quickly as possible, because it's suicide prevention, because it is going to protect them from the feelings of insecurity and inadequacy and not being who they want to be. It's going to bring a greater sense of alignment and congruity. If their genitalia can be made to match who they feel themselves to be inside, that's going to give them more reasons to live. That can help them have fulfilling lives. And if you would talk to someone on the right, who, if they met a trans person and work with them, they'd probably have a very good experience and be very friendly and supportive if it's a mainstream person. But their perception is, well, if this didn't exist until 5-10 years ago, then something happened. Either kids are being socially conditioned to think they're trans, and well-meaning teachers are quickly ushering them through a transition protocol to help them find physical affirmation with their internal sense of who they are. There's a lot of confusion that comes up. And we're so quick to say, oh, you're transphobic, homophobic, yada, yada. Usually it's not that. Usually they're worried about the kids the same way you are, but they think the answer is different. They think the answer is, okay, well, it's something in the environment that's messing with their hormones and their libido. It's something like that. It's something in society that's telling them that, hey, you can be special too if you have one of these situations. You'll be praised and held up and elevated if you're trans. You'll be supported and acknowledged. They don't want their kids to go through a transition and realize it's a mistake. You see, people on the left, I recently read an infographic that one of my friends posted that said, 99.9999% of people who receive gender-affirming care, they find it to be aligning and healthy and healing and profoundly shifting and life-saving treatment. And people who are against that want to murder trans people. People on the right are looking at different sets of information. They'll look at detransitioners like Chloe Cole, who had just horrific stories. They'll look at the Tavistock Clinic in the UK, which performed a lot of gender-affirming care, many transition surgeries, and I forget the number off the top of my head, but I think it's something like 25%, maybe it's 15%, but 25%, somewhere in there, hated what happened and sued, and the clinic had to close. And people on the right will see that and they say, look, we're tricking kids into making decisions they don't understand the weight of. Teenagers always think they know what they're doing, but they don't. And they're going to make mistakes. And we're trying to prevent them from making these mistakes. We don't want them to ruin their bodies by putting them through gender changing treatments and putting them on hormones. That's going to have effects that we don't well understand yet. We're not going to sterilize our kids because they may want to have children one day. I know anecdotes don't prove anything, but this is the kind of thing people hear. I have a friend, and when she was growing up, she thought she was a boy. She had her hair that way, shorter. She liked to wrestle. She liked to fight. She liked to do stuff in the woods. She thought of herself as a boy. Then as she was going deeper through puberty, she found more alignment with her female chemistry. And she said that she's grateful. If she was just a few years younger, some well-meaning people might have tried to talk her into transitioning, and then she wouldn't be able to be the mother and wife that she is today. And this is the kind of thing people on the right hear, and they think, you see, people can make mistakes, especially kids, and we want to protect them from making those mistakes. People on the right and the left, the mainstream, they are worried about protecting kids, but they have different sets of information. Now, could it be the Tavistock Clinic just happen to have the worst case scenario surgeons and circumstances? Maybe that's possible. Eventually, I have a lot of materials to do research on this, and I'm gonna, when the production quality is higher and I have more time to finish that research, then I'll do a nicer maybe documentary or series style thing on this. But at my current level of understanding, maybe those were just worst case scenarios, but those are the things that stand out. Another anecdote that proves nothing, but this is the kind of thing that people on the right latch onto. I was getting my hair cut maybe a year and a half ago, and the guy next to me was also getting his hair cut, and he was relating a terrible story. He said that, his son revealed that he's trans, and the guy was very happy about this and was very supportive, wanted to affirm his child's identity and helped with the transition. While the transition ended his marriage with his wife, and shortly after that, he went home and went to his son's room and found the child, unfortunately, had taken their life due to the surgery and due to the transition and finding it to be an irrevocable mistake. And the guy's just destroyed by this because he wanted to do the right thing for his kid. And it ended up in his mind dooming his kid. Now, I told you I'm 40 years old and I have met 5 trans people in person. I have a friend. I live in roughly the same area I grew up in. And I have a friend I went to school with. Her son is in roughly the same system that we were. Did I say that right? My friend, her son is in roughly the same system. Anyway, her son is in roughly the same system we were. And she was telling me something like 15 kids in the class, but 9 of them are some flavor of trans. And I'm thinking 9 in a class of 15? And it just has you question, well, why the great volume? Why the amount? Why is it so much more prevalent than in years past? And people on the right will say, well, maybe it's social conditioning, emotional contagion. Maybe it's something like the food that they're getting. There's hormones into chicken, something like that. And it's throwing off their biology. And so things aren't operating the way they should. So people on the right, they're looking at it like, well, if you're trans, you have this lifetime conflict, and then you could go to a surgery that may or may not help you. Or their idea is, well, let's clean up the environment, let's change schools, let's try and do something so that these kids aren't being brainwashed and their bodies aren't being damaged in some way that's making them perceive this conflict in their gender. Now, people on the left might find that horribly ignorant. I'll leave you to judge that. However, in all these illustrations, one point should be clear, that the mainstream on the right is not trying to round up trans people. They don't hate trans people. They're afraid of their kids getting hurt. They're afraid of their kids being confused and making a big mistake. Because who wasn't a teenager and made some mistake? Who didn't think that their first real relationship was going to last forever and it was their soulmate and it was a big part of their identity and it hurt? Like, this is how they're perceiving it. And they're trying to come from a compassionate angle and protect the children from the environmental toxins or the social conditioning or the mistakes that are leading people to becoming trans. They're not trying to round up the people that are already there. And if we would find some way to have a more open dialogue about this, I believe we could make a lot of good ground. I believe we could find commonality that could help bring us all together. You see, at a values level, both are trying to protect the innocent. Both are trying to protect children. At a values level, if a cool trans person was working with a cool person on the right who questions trans, they could become friends. They could become friends, and then they could come to support each other. But we've been demonizing each side so much that we only see the most extreme fringe versions. And then we say, well, I don't want no part of that fringe. and then we generalize. Part of our brain causes us to generalize. So, like when you learn to go up a flight of stairs, you don't have to relearn every time whether the stairs are tall or short, whether they're straight or crooked, whether it's a spiral staircase. Whether a doorknob is big or small, whether it's a handle you swing. Once you figure out how to use it, that information's generalized, and you know what to do. You don't have to relearn it every time. When we see some level of similarity, it's so easy. Oh, well, that person's on the right or that person's on the left. So everybody over there is like that. There's some level of generalization that goes on in. When we generalize, there's always inaccuracy. Everyone is not the fringe extreme. And even people on the fringe extreme can be nudged with enough positive examples, with enough examples of possibility, when their stereotypes are broken by solid evidence. But that doesn't happen when you're calling people transphobes and Nazis and idiots and child predators and all this kind of thing. That's not how you make inroads. Let's talk about another contentious issue, immigration. In my particular region, in a lot of my classes in school, I was a minority. I remember being one of 3 white people in a school, in a class, and there's 30-some kids, and hearing them stomp the ground and like clap and going, Puerto Rico, oh, white people, no. And I realized I got to shut up. I'm in a lot of my work environment, the Hispanic population was larger than the white population. I don't care about that. So many of these people are super cool. So many of them I'm friends with. And I understand the left argument, so often the meddling of the West, the US, Europe, etc., related powers, they've often messed with the governments, destroyed economies, bombed countries, and ruined these different regions. So, or at least contributed to their downfall, depending on where you stand on the issues. So, the people want to escape. And because our forefathers or our governments had some role to play, it'd be fair we should help them. And even if they didn't have any role to play, even if that's where you stand on the issue, it's still do what Jesus would do, feed the poor, help the needy. Support them. They're in need. People on the left say, hey, look, these people are looking for opportunity. They're looking for a better life, a chance to support their family, a chance to live their dreams. That's why they're coming here. And we need to help them have a better life. We can't just hoard all the money and opportunity. We need to help. People on the right, often, in my experience, people, again, there are bigots, racists in the world, but it's a smaller number than is often represented in mainstream. In my experience, the ones who are often the loudest and most vocal about immigration are immigrants from the same country who came in quote unquote legally. And they'll say things like, well, hey, I had to come across and it took a long time and I came in legally. I did it the right way. I learned the language. I became a citizen. I learned about the culture. I'm an American. And then they'll say what these people are doing is they're coming over. They're trying to get the money. They're driving down wages. They're not integrating. They're not learning the language. They're just trying to act like parasites, leech the money out of the economy, send it back to their areas, their families, where they could go back and be rich. And he goes, that's not right. We should put Americans first. And this is the kind of thing I heard a lot from people who were immigrants. I almost never hear white people in my environment talking about that end of it. And people on the right, they have other concerns with immigration, and I'm going to try and use non-inflammatory language to illustrate these points. Number one, I have friends that are black, white, Asian, Middle Eastern, Hispanic, all kinds. They're gay, straight, bi, trans. Any of them can come and visit me. They could come to my house. We'll hang out. We'll have food. We'll have a good time. Any of them can visit me. I don't care what their ethnicity is. I don't care what their gender is. We could have a good time. We could be friends. But there are a lot of white people that I don't want to have my address. And there's a lot of people in the world that I sure as shit don't want coming into my house. And I definitely don't want people secretly squatting in my house that I don't know about. I don't want there to be some stranger in my crawl space. Well, this is how a lot of people on the right see the border. We don't know who all's coming over. And we don't know what their intentions are. There are things we do know. A certain number are drug traffickers, and they bring fentanyl in. And so many of us have lost people to fentanyl. I lost a couple of friends. Some of my friends lost children. It's a terrible, terrible thing. And they become very sensitive to that. They want to stop that. Other people are worried about human trafficking. Not only abducting American kids to be human trafficked, but trafficking people who think they're sending their kids to a better opportunity and they're just being exploited or put in labor camps. Well, that's not good by any stretch of the imagination. Up until 2024, I knew more people who were trafficked or ritually abused than I knew trans people. That was a more eminent reality in my life. And that's how present it is for a lot of people on the right. I used to live in a border town. And El Paso, Texas. I could see Mexico from the window of my apartment. I never had any problem with people of any ethnicity. And that's a really heavily, thoroughly integrated town, I'll say. But you would occasionally hear, the complaints about people who would do things illegally. And that was years and years and years ago. At that time, people were dying in Juarez by the tens of thousands, which is the city right across the border. All my Mexican friends said, Shawn, never, ever go there. They'll kill you on sight. Maybe that was a slight exaggeration, but, that enough people warned me that I knew never to cross that border. A lot of people are thinking about it from the human trafficking angle, or the drug trafficking angle with fentanyl, or the work labor. Other people are looking at it from the angle of driving down wages. They say, hey, because they're not legal, they're not documented, they're not afforded any of the protections that citizens have. There ain't no OSHA, there ain't no Department of Labor. There's none of these things that are going to take care of them. And because of that, they could be paid very low wages. I have another anecdote for you. 90s, early 2000s, I had an uncle. He's no longer with us, but he had a construction company. He had two. One did drywall, one did concrete. And he paid his people well. But later 2000s, there were so many people who were using undocumented workers who were being paid a third of the rate that he couldn't pay his people anymore, and it went down. And it's not like you easily have the opportunity to compare it. Well, here's the quality of the job versus what you're going to get. People just say, well, you're charging 3 times as much as these 3 other companies. Why am I going to go with you? And then, so his companies went under. And again, this is the kind of thing that people hear. Hey, they often say, I want to help people, but we have to put Americans first. We have to make sure that they have jobs. There are veterans who don't have jobs. There are so many homeless people who could work, but that they're not in a position. So why? So they're sympathetic for the economic situation, but they say, help them after all of us are in a good position. Put every American who's able to work into a stronger situation, a financially better employment situation. And then we could talk about helping other people, particularly those who came and have no interest in coming and being a part of our society. They just want to leech our money. And the idea, another fear that's on the right, is the idea that when mass populations from the same country come in, they don't have to integrate into society. They can just set up a parallel society with their own culture and their own laws and their own businesses that cater to one another, and they don't have to learn the language, and they can just, kind of siphon money out of the American system. And because they have different values, different cultures, different laws, when the two groups intersect, there's violence, there's challenges, like we're seeing in different parts of Europe more prominently. And so it would be like, for example, if the Americans from today met the Americans from, 100 years ago, where the values shifted and clothing shifted and what people are allowed to wear and what they're allowed to say. And there'd be massive fights and conflict because culturally they're in a different spot. Now, there's a phrase that is touching at a slogan level. Diversity is our strength. And diversity of ethnicity, of gender, of all of that is a great thing. But diversity of values, which I alluded to at the beginning of the video, when people say, I'm not going to align with people who have different values than me. A lot of times people from different cultures, they sometimes value things in a different way. And their way of serving those values can sometimes be different. And what's happening is, with the open-minded and deep-hearted desire to care for everybody and not make the new people who are coming in feel othered in some way, sometimes they're given preferential presentation over the majority in a particular country or region. And then that's where there's a lot of the more hateful rhetoric. And then that kind of bitterness begins to summon up some of those fringe characters that we talked about. And then they begin to gain more influence. And we don't want them to gain influence. Personally, if I am for integration of people from every nation, every region, but true integration. And by that, I mean, you have to, if I were to move to China, I'd have to learn Mandarin and/or Cantonese. If I were to move to Japan, I have to know Japanese. If I move to Saudi Arabia, I have to know Arabic. If I move to Greece, I have to know Greek. And not for xenophobic reasons, simply to have better social context, to be able to build friends and relationships, to have access to government services. The more above board that I am, the more access to opportunity that I have, the more access to protections that I have, the more aligned with the government I can be, the more aligned with the culture and the people I can be. But when that's not happening, when you have vast groups of people who are staying to themselves but are entering into an area, they're not integrating, they're not becoming a part of a culture, they're not thinking of themselves as Brits or Germans or Americans. They're thinking of themselves from, I'm from Colombia, I'm from Chile, I'm from the Philippines, I'm from one of these other regions. They don't think of themselves that way. And this is where a lot of conflict begins to rise. The slogan, diversity is our strength, I think it means well, and I think it sounds good. But in a practical sense, diversity of what? Ethnicity? Yeah, 100%. The US, for example, where I'm from, was always called the melting pot because people from all over the world could come together and become Americans and have opportunity. And in that sense, that's how diversity could be the strength. I understand that we haven't always lived up to that. I understand mistakes have been made, terrible, grievous, horrible mistakes that I will cover in future episodes. You know, the Trail of Tears, you know, putting all the Japanese in camps during World War II and terrible, terrible, horrible things. Slavery. I'm going to cover all those in future episodes after I do more research on some of those things. But also, the West is where everyone in the world wants to go. You don't see these numbers moving to China or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Mexico, or you're seeing them go to the West because there's something in the West that's valuable. Diversity is our strength in the sense that at least the ideals and the values of people from anywhere can come together and build a future and have opportunity and freedom of expression and can learn to be all they can be. That's a powerful message. That's a beautiful message. But when it's, as I started with the beginning of this video, when there's such a diversity in values, in ideas on where the country should go, that's the cause of every war, every conflict. And sometimes it can be difficult to open up the dialogue, to begin to build bridges. Even in the same cultures like we're talking about here, it's I'm having a whole show about trying to build bridges in the same culture. So it's even more difficult when people are from a different region and they have completely different ideas of what should be going on. That can be another issue. So people on the right are very sensitive to these fears. People on the left, they're super concerned. You know, both want to protect people. And in different ways, both have care for the immigrants. People on the right, they don't want immigrants to be trafficked. They don't want them to be put in labor camps. They don't want them to be exploited. They don't want them to be used to run drugs. They don't want them to be forced into a criminal life or to be taken advantage of in any way. And people on the left care about them by wanting to give them freedom and protection and opportunity and security and the chance to build themselves up and be who they want to be. What differs is what are the best ways to do that? And you could talk about that. One day I'm going to do more research and have a special on this, but we need to close these gaps. We need to build bridges. We need to understand that no matter what country you're from, no matter what region, no matter what gender you experience, we're all part of the same human family. We all have the same human heart beating in our chests, and we all matter. We all value. And how do we serve these values? How do we protect each other? How do we take care of each other? We've all seen the person who gives, and gives, and then they're broke and then they need help. Well, that's, or the person who will bend over backwards for you and then they become a doormat and they're taking care, while they're taking care of everybody, they're stomped on and used and exploited. And, you know, frankly, I'm passionate about that because I lost several of my dearest friends to that kind of situation. So what's the right balance? What's the right way to do it? How do we take care of people? Because at a values level, so many of us can relate. We can connect somewhere. How do we shift consciousness? How do we find unity in the polarity. And that's by being curious, by building bridges. I have so many friends that I've worked with. Now, it wasn't classy to ask them, but rumor was that so many people I knew are undocumented or illegal. So many. But that don't mean I don't care about them. That doesn't mean I don't want them to have an opportunity. I would love them to be in this country. I would love them to have jobs and opportunities. And because I believe that their status may be illegal, those opportunities are not available to them at this time. And a lot of them aren't trying to integrate into the society. Keeping minimum level of language, for instance, after being around for years and years. I don't want them to be exploited. I don't want them to fear the guy in charge. I care about these people. But what's the right way to serve that caring? Is it to reward every person who broke a law and came in? Well, they wouldn't. That's a complicated issue. And that's not going to prevent some of the dangers that have been let in. People on the right will look at the cases of, oh, this person came in illegally and they did this crime or that crime, or this gang came in. And sometimes the media will on the right will overrepresent some of these claims. And media on the left will underrepresent some of these things and laugh. Haha, no, everyone who's came across the border is a wholesome, saint-like person trying to build a better life. And I'd love to believe that. But that's not been my experience. And even if they mean well, while people are staying in their individual group while they're not integrating, there's going to be bumps. There's going to be opportunities for exploitation. There's going to be conflicts. I was talking to someone recently about his grandparents, and he said, his grandparents were German and Italian, and they tried to come over during the war, and they spent 2 years on Ellis Island. And he felt particularly passionate about it because he said, my grandparents were stuck there for a long time before they were allowed entry and the opportunity to become citizens. But people are just coming in and taking what my grandparents fought and suffered to have. Now, I'm not saying that people who immigrate here through undocumented means aren't going through tremendous suffering. Sometimes the hardship there is enormous. But that's another reason why we should talk about this in a sane way. Perhaps the pathway could be streamlined. Perhaps the way to become a legal citizen of Europe or the US or Canada or whatever should be more streamlined, should be more open-minded. If suddenly 500,000 people enter into a town of 100,000 people, well, that's rough on the economy. There's not going to be enough jobs. That's going to drive down wages. That's going to have people starving and then people turning to illegal means to feed their families. That's a very dangerous situation, even if everyone involved is initially well-meaning. It's like we talked about in the beginning, when something changes too rapidly, it's not a stable shift. In the same way, when management changes and they have a new vision for a company and then they implement a whole bunch of new protocols and rules, unless those are sustained long enough, it's not going to stabilize and they're going to fall away, and whatever benefits those rules or ideas would have aren't going to be utilized. Well, it's the same thing when too large of a population comes into an area too quickly. The area can't adjust fast enough. It can't build up industry. Apartments can't be built instantly. There won't be housing, there won't be food, the supply chain can't adapt that rapidly. So when you have an enormous volume of people coming into a particular region, even if they wanted to integrate, well, if the volume's too high, the local economies simply cannot adapt fast enough. Just like when a new idea is introduced to society, sometimes it's too quick to gain acceptance. And it might take generations for that to work out. These are basic understandings we need to develop. But if we stop demonizing one another, we can see the concerns that each others have, the fears. People on the left don't want people to be hurt, to starve. People on the right don't want their families to starve. They don't want their families to be hurt by people coming in. And they don't want the good people who are trying to make it into this country to be hurt either. But if vast numbers are coming in, you don't know who they are. Well, you don't know who has access to your house. You don't know who's squatting in the crawl space. And that's a dangerous thing. Everyone is coming from a caring point of view, but we're not even talking. We can't have the sense that a lot of people are coming from a good place. Sure, there are extremes, but a lot of people are coming from a good place. And if we could meet there and assume that the majority has some positive intent, they're just going off of the information they have, we could build that curiosity. We can understand, how could a good person think this about trans people or think this about immigration? How could a good person arrive at these circumstances? What information did they have to hear? What life experiences led them to develop these assumptions? Well, we don't know. This is why we need to be curious. We need to build bridges. And we can build bridges. We can open hearts. We could build understanding. We could get everybody to gain acceptance at higher rates if we could start talking. And if we could start discussing, well, what's an efficient way for us to meet our objectives? You know, how do we have security and take care of the people who need a place to go? How do we accommodate those people who have a vast conflict with their biological equipment, and yet not accidentally usher people into making mistakes that are going to haunt them for the rest of their lives? How do we do that? We can't even begin to talk about these strategies until we can open our hearts, until we can hear each other. And that's what we're striving to do. Once again, if you haven't watched the first video, I call it the introduction. I lay out some of this in pretty concise detail. I'm actually kind of proud of the content, not necessarily the backdrop or the editing that I have. If you like what we're trying to do, let me know. Like, share, follow, comment, engage, help boost the algorithm. If you're in a good position, please consider checking out my givesendgo.com/SZP. That's Shawn Zemba podcast. And together we can work on moving our world in a better direction. All right, rock on, party on. This is Shawn signing out.